Many studies have looked at the impact that the media has had on helping populists to power. But I now want to ask the opposite question. What effect does ruling populism have on how we work? One person who studied this intensively is the Gates Cambridge scholar Ayala Paniewski. She's looked at the way that populist rhetoric has been used to discredit and to disempower journalists. We got used to that enemies of the people vitriol at the height of the MAGA days. But then came more subtle ways: doxing of journalists, cyberbullying, the tweeting out of private journalistic inquiries to encourage a public pile-on. She notes that even the right of reply can and frequently is used as a way of them airing claims that are meant to put journalists in their place, as they know that a fair and balanced media will feel compelled to cover them. But, and I think this is where it gets interesting, apart from these methods of incitement of the public, there's also, she says, the impact on journalists themselves. This is her. The way populist rhetoric is used to discredit journalists turns into a sophisticated form of soft censorship. And she uses a term that I hadn't come across before, strategic bias, to explain the way we may be inclined to respond to accusations made against us. Unlike other targets of populist criticism, journalists find themselves required to mediate. We have to mediate that criticism to the public, so we are then put in a particularly awkward position. And the outcome, she writes, is ironic, that journalists under attack end up practicing bias in order to signal their balance and impartiality. It is, she believes, a coping mechanism. We do it to ourselves. Now, populism, make no mistake, is not a traditional ism of ideology. It's not Marxism or Reaganism. It has no adherence to a set belief or policy. The political scientist Kasmuda explains it as the idea that society is separated into two groups at odds with one another, the pure people and the corrupt elite. The editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, Moises Naim, goes a step further. He says, populism is best understood as a strategy for gaining and wielding power. Frequently, it's a method of campaigning, often in the guise of the underdog. And once in power, in government, it continues to campaign, picking imaginary fights to assert its struggle, even though it is now demonstrably, undeniably, the top dog, not the underdog. So what follows here, just to be clear, is not a critique of left or right, Conservatives versus Labour, Democrat versus Republican. None of this has anything to do with policy. It's why populist parties can shapeshift between the right and left, attract voters of traditional parties or none. It's not an ideology. It is a means to achieve and retain power. And I speak from experience when I say that it took us too long to recognise it for what it was and to find the journalistic tools needed to deal with it. I remember, to my shame, interviewing the Trump acolyte Sebastian Gorka on Newsnight in the early days of the Trump victory. Gorka would use up most of the interview time by screaming abuse at the BBC. Now, he didn't have any problem with the BBC. He quite liked the BBC, and he was always happy to say yes to the interview. But he used our time on air, and that of many of my colleagues, as an effective conduit to sell a key populist message, that the mainstream media could be dismissed as fake. Now, once you understand how this works, it seems so obvious. You kick down belief in a trusted source of news. You make the audience doubt what they're seeing, and you step into the breach, a shameless play for power and dominance. But in those days, I didn't. And as a journalist, I was mortified. And I would spend half of our allotted interview time trying to defend our objectivity, and the rest bending over backwards to reconcile his strangled version of the truth just to prove his criticism of me wrong. In so doing, ironically, I lost the very objectivity I was seeking to defend. When I was writing this, I actually looked back at an interview I did with him in 2018 to see if Ayala Paniewski's words rang true. I was thinking, won't be me, I'll be fine. I was horrified. My opening question to him, I said this: Dr. Gorka, I know in our previous encounters we have spent a lot of time analysing whether Newsnight itself is fake news. So just for the sake of our viewers and moving the story on, why don't we agree to recognise that's how you view things? It is insane. We didn't spend a lot of time analysing. He levelled the accusation to get social media traction, and I allowed it to become viable debate. You see where I'm going with this? Either way, Gorka won and the BBC lost. This was when Donald Trump was already finding his feet as president. But our mistakes started long before that. I'm going to take you this time to early 2016. The UK is beginning to debate the big questions around Britain's potential exit from the EU. It's complicated stuff. We're trying to offer our viewers both sides of a fiendishly difficult debate, and that intention was right. But we still got it wrong. We fell into what we might call the Patrick Minford paradigm. In other words, it might take our producers 5 minutes to find 60 economists who feared Brexit and 5 hours to find a sole economic voice who espoused it. But by the time we went on air, we simply had one of each. We presented this unequal effort to our audience as if it was balance. It wasn't. I'd later learn that the ungainly name for this myopic style of journalism was both-sidism, which talks to the way it reaches a superficial balance whilst obscuring a deeper truth. This stage, I'd never heard the term, or indeed the criticism. I just thought we were doing our job. 1 year after the Brexit vote, shortly after the 2017 election had left Prime Minister May without a majority and in a particularly precarious position, I remember interviewing the prominent Leave campaigner, also a former candidate for Prime Minister, Andrea Leadsom. The EU Council President had told the BBC of his concerns over Brexit relations. And when I asked Ms. Leadsom what she could point to that was going well in the negotiations, she told me, with some exasperation, it would be helpful if broadcasters were willing to be a bit patriotic. The country took a decision. Now look, you could argue that my patriotism at that moment was shown in an attempt to do the job well, interpret for our licence fee-paying public the state of government negotiations. But I do think that's missing the point. It's certainly missing the strategy. Because the way populism works on us as journalists is to somehow seek to divide us from the public, to make us feel that we are not of the people, that those in power are the only ones that can understand normal folk, and that we, the media, are somehow getting in the way of that relationship between the people and their government. Back to Paniewski, who writes, this failure is framed as the media's grand conspiracy against the populist as the representative of the people. I wonder if you remember Donald Trump's admission to the CBS correspondent Leslie Stahl on the campaign trail. She would later tell an awards dinner of the moment that he admitted the real reason for his continually bashing the press. I'm quoting Ms. Stahl here. She said, he said, you know why I do it. I do it to discredit you all and demean you all. So when you write negative stories about me, no one will believe you. The larger the gap, in other words, that populists can create between recognisable media sources and the people, the less impeded they will be by any scrutiny, any attempt to hold them accountable for the decisions they make in power. You think that's old news? Just last week, Liz Truss told the host of the GB News hustings, it's not the BBC here, you actually get your facts right. It was an artful bit of flattery which she used to evade a challenging question.